Okay, very good. So we are up to page Reish Lametet. Now, Joshua, have you ever learned this book, Orchot Tzaddikim in Hebrew, or The Way of the Righteous in English? But you read Hebrew a bit, correct?
I went to Yeshiva college, so I was in a Chabad school for like 13 years.
Oh, fantastic! So you have quite a good background. Then you can read and follow and understand. So this is a classic of Musar. It's a Musar book, and it's called Orchot Tzaddikim, which is translated usually into English as the ways or the ways of the righteous. And it's a book which examines many different attributes, usually in pairs of positive and negative. Although right now, towards the end of the book, we're in the chapter which is dealing with Torah study. So it's very good. It actually turns out during Hanukkah, when we're trying to strengthen ourselves in Torah study, and it was basically at the beginning of the chapter discussing how important Torah study is in the regular running of the world. Then he went into kind of a long detour into the history of Torah study, talking about the oral Torah and the written Torah, regarding the oral Torah, the Mishnah and the Gemara, who wrote it down and at what time period and for what reason. Also Jewish scholarship after the Talmud period, which is the period of the Gaonim and the Rishonim. And a lot of this was taken from the Rambam's writings of, I believe it's in the introduction to his Perush, his explanation on the Mishnah. But I think at this point we're ready to start the last section, the concluding section of this chapter, on Reish Lamed Tet, the paragraph at the bottom of the page, starting with the word Va'od. Va'od, in general, he's going to be continuing on the general decline that he's described, the general decline that there has been in Torah scholarship, where you have many less people learning on much less of a high level of learning, so that qualitatively and quantitatively, the Jewish scholarship is kind of unfortunately been going downhill, and we are trying to do our best to slow the pace of that decline, and that's the purpose here of this section. So it says, "Va'od b'dor hazeh." Furthermore, in this generation, Nishtakecha haTorah, Torah has been by and large forgotten. Mechmat ki alomdim halalu suvurim la'asor kamo harishonim u'la'asik b'filpulim, because people who are learning nowadays think to do like those in early generations, and they learn in what's called pilpul. Have you heard of pilpul? Mm-hmm. Pilpul is related, I guess it's lit patel, really. It's related to the word hit patel, which means to kind of it patel. Wade. What? Not wade, but wiggle. Hit patel, and it's referring to an approach in Torah learning where it might be described nowadays as Talmudic hair splitting. Now, it's very important to learn thoroughly, to learn in depth, but at a certain point, the learning in depth takes too much of a toll on a person's breadth in learning. So it's very important to learn in depth, but if it's at the expense of breadth, meaning knowing a larger amount of information, then that becomes problematic. And what the author here is criticizing is in later times, and he's really writing this maybe 500 years ago. This is not a book in modern times. Even 500 years ago, he says that even people in his days who were learning Torah were spending too much time, too much energy, devoting too much emphasis on the fine points on learning, which is important on a certain level, but again, if it's at the expense of knowing more information less thoroughly, according to the approach of this author at least, it would be better to know less about more than more about less. Less about more than more or less. It doesn't mean that your learning should be superficial, but there's a certain amount of information that you need to know in order to know what to do, what to think. Right? Going into even finer detail is expending more time and energy than is perhaps justifiable. And he's coming to criticize that. That being said, we all are in a yeshiva in modern times, which is patterned after the Ashkenazi model that was developed in Europe, right, several centuries ago, where there is definitely a tradition of pilpul. So that in a modern yeshiva based on the Ashkenazi model, and it applies even in the Sephardi world, who nowadays have their yeshivas by and large patterned after the Ashkenazi model of the yeshiva as well, there is this tension about spending too much time and too much detail on things which are not going to be, generally speaking, practically implemented. And the yeshiva model tried to address that by having the morning section dedicated to learning in depth, and the afternoon section learning in breadth. That's called iyun and bekias. At our level, we're not perhaps learning Gemara all day long to have that division, but as you progress in the levels, and generally that's how the yeshiva's daily schedule is broken up. The first part of the day, as you probably know, is iyun, and the second part of the day is bekius. Iyun meaning in-depth learning, bekius, after learning. Very often, it's the same masechta. So let's say you're learning ksuvos. You might be learning a small amount of information very much in depth in the morning, and then learning ksuvos in the afternoon, a page a day, or side a day. So that over a term, in your iyun, you might be only covering a few pages, whereas in your bekius, you might be covering many, many chapters in order to complement each other. So that's how the yeshiva model has tried to address this conflict here, this tension. But even in iyun, and that's what he's talking about. Even within iyun, a person has to just have to work out very carefully how much energy to dedicate to the iyun. And there would be those who argue that the Ashkenazi yeshiva model of iyun is too much, even if you have a bekius afternoon. The iyun itself is too much iyun. That was not the practice of the Sephardim until recent times, and that wasn't the practice of even the Ashkenazi Hasidim. The approach was much more learning properly, learning in depth, but to a level where you know what you need to know in order to do, and then go on. But the type of intellectual acrobatics that can result from putting too much of an emphasis on iyun, that Talmudic hair splitting, is something which the Sephardim and even the Ashkenazi Hasidim refrained from doing. It's nevertheless become more common even among the other groups nowadays. But there is this tension that we should be aware of. In any case, here, the author is writing 500 years ago, I believe, from more in the land of Israel and from part of the Sephardic tradition, and therefore he is saying it's not good nowadays, all of this emphasis people are placing on pilpul. Pilpul is like abstract argumentation. It's too abstract. They put so much emphasis on learning in depth, but they can't be compared to the sages of France, but in the times of the Tosfot, where the Tosfot were learning very much in depth. But he says, in his times, people were trying to learn like Tosfot, but they weren't Tosfot. The authors of the Tosfot, you're familiar with the Tosfot, right? The commentators in the Gemara, printed on the Gemara page, in addition to that of Rashi. Their hearts were wide open. And they were fully engaged and immersed in Torah study. That was their, like, quote-unquote, livelihood. They lived it. And they would literally sacrifice themselves on account of Torah study. Yomam v'layla, day and night. And therefore, they were actually able to derive some tangible benefit, some practical application out of their very in-depth learning. But nowadays, your average learner doesn't know how to do this. They end up confusing one another and confusing themselves. And what they end up doing is wasting most of their day involved in this type of a learning. How is he saying here? So he says they're learning actually the actual how should I put this? The beneficial portion of their learning becomes actually the temporary, the less significant part of their learning, and whereas this kind of, I don't know, overtime spent on this over-analysis becomes the majority of their learning. So that's not good. But in the time of the Talmud, people would go away and learn for 10 years at a time. I think, Isaac, you and I learned together the Gemara, which talks about Rabbi Akiva and other sages there who went away and learned for how long? Remember?
12 years.
12 years, right? So that's what he says here. They would go away for 10 years and even more. That's what they went. And their learning was very well established. If somebody would sneeze in the middle of learning, they would not say, God bless you. Why? That was considered to be Bidul Torah. They were so engaged in their learning, they took learning so seriously, right, that if somebody sneezed, they wouldn't even interrupt their learning to say Asusa. And that, by the way, is the halacha and the custom nowadays. In the middle of learning, you don't interrupt your learning even to say God bless you to someone. In order not to nullify. It could be that if a person is not aware of this being considered to be the proper decorum, on the contrary, he'd think if you don't say God bless you, then you would be being rude. Then in that scenario, of course, you should say to the person, God bless you. Yeah? But I'm just saying, nowadays when it is appropriate, we're careful not to interrupt learning with anything that's mundane. Even something as short and insignificant as that.
But isn't it the same with answering Amen when there's a minyan? If you're that involved into your studies, then you don't actually have to answer Amen.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Although it seems to me that customarily that if a person is learning, let's say, in a place where other people are davening, then in order not to look like he's deviating from the community or not interested in the God that the community is praying in, then people will answer Amen or move to another place.
So I don't get it. He's saying that it shouldn't be like this?
No, what he's saying is that he's criticizing a certain type of learning that was done even in his day, where people were putting an overemphasis on this type of Talmudic hair splitting, when he said that approach might have been appropriate for people who are on the level and also devoting the type of time to Torah study that the authors of the Tosfot and the Talmud were doing. But in his time, he said it was already inappropriate for people to be learning in that way because they're just getting confused and confuse other people. The Baalei Tosfot, and he's just giving an example how in those times, they were on such a level that they would not interrupt their learning for anything, not even to say God bless you when a person sneezed.
So why are we reverting to these sorts of?
Well,
it's not good for his time. Surely it'd be even more so.
Why are we not reverting to what? To
if he's saying that in the 500 years ago,
yeah,
it's sort of we shouldn't be putting so much effort into hair splitting things or not even saying bless you when someone sneezes.
Yeah.
Surely all that by in our day, it should be even more lenient rather than
I understand
saying let's make the halakha what was in Rashi's.
I understand what you're saying. You make a good point, but I think if we try and bring this down to practical level, what the author would say is that we're on a much lower level of learning than they were. They learned constantly and in great depth, and their learning was so great that they wouldn't even, as the Talmud says, interrupt for anything mundane during their learning, even something as seemingly insignificant as God bless you, for example. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, our level of learning is much less than that, and therefore we should not try and copy their approach to learning. Rather, we should have our level of learning be much more down-to-earth, straightforward, and practical. That being said, I think the author would say, regarding the custom of not saying God bless you, we should still try and preserve that, because that's not going to detract from your learning. His point is, putting so much emphasis on learning in depth is going to distract us and take us away from the mark, and therefore that's actually not going to help.
Mm-hmm. I think it gets to the point where it's like, where do you stop?
Yeah, in terms of...
you don't stop it at some point, so if some rabbi hasn't stopped it, then it's like, well...
Yeah, and that's another important point here, which is, again, if as beginners, and we're realizing what type of Torah world we're moving into, being much different than that which was existent 500 years ago, if it's considered to be rude, if you don't recognize a person in one way or the other, this is just one example about the God bless you, but it could be any other form as well. So then, of course, it would be better to give the person the recognition and not risk avoiding him or offending him or giving the impression that you're some Baal Tosfot, that you won't even say God bless you to somebody who sneezes, right? So go ahead, by all means, and I would extend that even further. You have two people who are sitting down now to have a chavrusa, and they're going to learn together, let's say, 2 or 3 hours. We're not at a level to learn for 2 or 3 hours straight. Sometimes you need a break. You have to take a breather. So you get up and go to the bathroom. You get up and have a coffee or tea. Sometimes even without getting up, you're in the base of Midrash. It's considered to be acceptable nowadays to talk about something else. Whatever it might be. Yeah? Whatever it might be. But that should certainly be limited as much as possible. In other words, we're not Baalei Tosfos. On the other hand, we do want to take our learning as serious as possible. So we're going to sit down and learn for 3 hours. So maybe every hour we'll take 5 or 10 minutes just to maybe talk about the weather or talk about this or that or the other. And sometimes when you have people who are learning Torah and growing in Yiddishkeit, they need also to talk about other things that are interesting to them or might be on their mind, if it has to do with Jewish philosophy or different types of challenges that a person might have. Sometimes chavrusas stop their learning in order to talk about those things as well. Right? It could be quite appropriate for their level. But I'm just trying to kind of bring that practically to us nowadays. The main thrust of what he's saying here is that while learning in depth is good, we have to be realistic. And trying to go too in depth could actually distract us from the goal. Now we're on page Reish Mem, about 5 lines down. Towards the end of the line, you'll see parentheses. Mizeh ha'inyan yesh ledas roiv kviyusam. And in this matter, meaning the behavior and the approach of these earlier generations, it's through that approach of theirs which we find indicative the seriousness and the consistency with which they approach their Torah learning. But as opposed to nowadays, when we don't have that. V'amrinan b'ksuvos, and we say, meaning it says in the Talmud in Ksuvos, Rav Yosef b'rei derava, shederei avuha levei Rav kamid Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef, who was the son of Rava, shederei avuha, he was sent by his father, levei Rav, to the house of the rabbi, meaning the yeshiva, Kamid Rav Yosef, before Rav Yosef. Poskule shis shnin. So they agreed or arranged that he should learn for 6 years. Ki havet lo shnin, when 3 years passed, moto ma'ale yom de Kippur, there came the day of the eve of Yom Kippur. Omar, he said, Ezil ve'echze la'anshe beisi. I'm going to go home and visit my family on Erev Yom Kippur, only after 3 years of learning. In other words, they had set up they were going to learn for 6 years. And he went, after 3 years, he wanted to go home and see his family. Shoma avuha, his father heard about this. Shakal narga nafak la'ape. And he, I guess, I'm not quite sure what he's saying here. Shakal narga, he took some type of like a hammer or something, an instrument. A narga is usually some type of a pin or a bolt of a door or something like this. Some instrument. Nafak la'ape, and he put it in his face. Amarle, Yoinasan, Niskarta. V'amri lo, Zukosach, Niskarsa. Yoinosach, not Yonasan. Yoinosach niskarta. Oh, you're thinking about your dove. Who's that referring to? His wife. Normally there are those who say, Zukosach niskarta. You're thinking about your wife, your soulmate. Itrud, he became very upset about this. Lo mar ifsik, v'lo mar ifsik. He didn't stop and he didn't stop. That I'm not sure what he's referring to.
Maybe they went at it at each other.
Was that?
Maybe they went at
each other. There was,
at each other.
Yeah, there was like some kind of contention between them. Yeah. Let's see from the explanation here if we can get a clear view of what actually happened. Rei veheven zeinin. Contemplate this. What happened here in the story. Kama hayu dveikim b'Torah. How strongly connected they were to Torah. Al ken zochu l'ruach hakodesh. And as a result of this, they merited the divine inspiration through their Torah study. So I guess he's not going to spell that out. I'll try and look that up and get a clearer answer for tomorrow. But in any case, you see from here, from the discussion, the agreement that he was going to learn for 6 years held at least for 3 straight years where he didn't see his family at all. Only on Erev Yom Kippur, after the 3rd year, did he decide to see the family. Remember the Gemaras that we saw spoke about how the sages didn't go home for a full 12 years. So much so that when people came home, they didn't even recognize their town because it had changed. People didn't recognize their family members because they had changed. We learned there that perhaps was under dire circumstances at the time when the Romans were decreeing against the Jews, prohibiting them from learning Torah. And therefore, people couldn't learn Torah openly. They had to flee to the far-reaching parts of the country, up in the north, in the Golan, in the Galil, and things like this. But still, 3 years is a long time not to go home. But this is how serious they were about their Torah study. So much so that the one was criticized severely by the other, by his father, I believe, because he wanted to go home and see his family after 3 years. And also in France, they would also learn Torah greatly and for a great period of time. And they would dwell in one place, lilmod kol Talmud, in order to learn the entire Talmud. And they would repeat the Talmud constantly so that they knew it by heart. And they never stopped speaking words of Torah. That's how greatly immersed they were in it. We learn for half an hour, maybe 2 hours at the most, and then we start talking about sports. We have lunch and we talk about politics. We listen to the radio, play some music, work out, get back to learning in the afternoon for another hour or two, and then at night have dinner. In the evening, watch a movie, or I don't know what people do. So in the end of the day, after a day goes by, how much learning do we do? A few hours. 1 hour here, an hour there, 2 hours here, 2 hours there.
I think it's all the tivus we have around these days as well.
The tivus, the things that we desire that call our attention and distract us.
Like they didn't have computers. They didn't have.
That's right.
So they needed something else to pass the day, and that I guess would kind of be their entertainment on top. Even though it's study, it's considered entertainment because it was a way to pass time.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, it's true that they didn't have as many maybe intrusive type of distractions that we have today, but the majority of people were not doing what they were doing. They were doing other things.
Playing cards.
Yeah, so whatever other people did to pass the day, they could have done also. Yeah, but they didn't.
We hear great rabbis who'd play chess,
Yeah. So that, it was probably their downtime. Once a year they'd play a game of chess. In any case, and they would never stop their Torah learning. And they would be involved in Torah study constantly. And that was the point I was getting at, is that nowadays it's true. We learn very little and we have many different distractions. It might be because we have the distractions and they didn't. But I think it's also because of the fact that they had a greater love and commitment and dedication of self-sacrifice to the Torah than we do. So it was probably both your point, and it was not, and also the proactive commitment they had to Torah, which is greater than that we have, and therefore that's why they were able to attain these great levels of Torah study. Lo'olam ligrois enosh va'af al gav de mishkach. A person should always learn, even if he's going to forget. Va'af al gav de lo yoda mai ka'amar, and even if he doesn't know what he's saying, the Gemara tells us. Just learning and reading, even if he's going to forget, or even if he doesn't understand right now what he's saying, is better than not being involved in learning at all. Va'amri, and furthermore the sages say, Mikara ligmar enish, a person should first learn, v'hadar lizbar, and then go back and understand the reasoning behind it. So again, the author here is finding sources. He's presenting sources to substantiate the point that he's making, is that it's better to know less about more than more about less. Even if it means you're going to be reading a little more superficially, even if you're not going to remember what you're reading, even if you don't even understand right now what you're reading, the first is to get through a lot of information and then go back and understand it in more detail. This is not necessarily the approach.
I like this guy. That's what I do. Like when I'm reading like Mesilat Yesharim or something like that.
Yeah.
I just want to get through it all, and then later I'll go back to focusing on little bits. But otherwise, when I learn with groups, it's like we spend an entire hour just on half a paragraph.
Yeah.
I'm not getting anywhere here.
Yeah.
It's a waste of my time. I'm thinking about how much I could have. I'm not saying there was no benefit to it, but it's not the best use of time for me.
Right.
But I like the idea of like I need like the bigger picture.
That's right.
Let me get the basic structure of everything, and then later I can then maybe understand the details in light of
a little bit.
Right.
Yeah, like we'll go into the details of everything a bit.
Yeah,
later.
that's the approach that he's describing
You
here.
end up just sort of a bit too baffled.
Yeah.
By the,
Well, now I mean that's generally the approach.
Details when you don't know
the larger picture.
Yeah.
And Mesilat Yesharim talks about that you have to have the larger picture in order to be able to categorize the details. If you don't have the larger picture, then how are you going to organize the details?
In contradiction with davening, it's better to know like one section of, supposedly they say one section of davening, instead of just reading what you're saying, to actually understand what it is that you're connecting with God. It's not.
Yeah.
I get very frustrating in davening because of that. I'd rather just go there, just do one thing, the bits that I do know
understand why you're saying
properly, rather than sitting there going. What happens is my brain just goes into like I'm not keeping up with everyone. I can't read this bit, but they've all left the room half an hour. So, be here now
So that's very interesting.
Later.
So like you said, so that contradicts what you were saying just a minute ago about the learning. So what's going on here? I think that the truth is that you really, ideally, you really should have both. You should have both, and strike a proper balance of breadth and also depth. And sometimes, in order to get the breadth, you actually need to break it down into parts and work on each part thoroughly, and so that you could actually have the breadth. Something with prayer, where you're not really, although you could, but you're not really learning it like you would learn a piece of Gemara. There, you're talking about just even getting a superficial...
Just even an understanding.
Yeah, just a superficial familiarity and understanding with it. There, if you don't have at least that, it's a non-starter. So what you have to do is break it down piece by piece, just to get each piece a basic familiarity, like an understanding of it, right?
So when you start off, they always say, you start with Shema. Why do you always start with Shema? Because it's one of the easiest sections I find that to get a bit of an understanding on.
Right.
And then once you understand the basics, which is like Shema, then you work on Shemona Esrei and Ashrei and everything else around it. Right.
So in a way, you're talking about just attaining a superficial understanding of the prayer requires you to break it down into its parts initially. Why don't we say, first get a general overview of the prayer and then work on the details?
I don't know. I think the problem is that we're talking about two separate things. Like it's not when it comes to just learning about how the service is structured. Yeah, like that I do is like this prayer is doing that, then that's doing that, and then you learn the prayer, learn them one at a time.
Yes.
So I'm saying if you haven't learned them all, when it comes to actually it's time for davening.
Doing it, yes.
Doing it, it's like because our point is about intention and stuff like that.
Right.
Whereas if I'm just trying to do it all properly without understanding it, the intention goes, and all I'm thinking about is when is this going to finish already?
You don't really get that connection with God either.
No, I'm just sitting there thinking.
Because if you're reading the English and you're understanding the connection with God and what you're saying, you're thinking about. Yeah. You're actually physically thinking about having a connection with God. When you're just reading, you're not actually thinking of the connection. You're just reading words.
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting. So it would seem to me then that what this would suggest is that you should first have it doesn't have to be first; it can be simultaneously. But it would be good from the outset to have a familiarity with the general structure of the prayer service, and then take your time to work on the pieces part by part. even if that means initially focusing only on that part to the expense of other parts, so that at least you're working on connecting to and actually kind of mastering those parts. So that over time, over a week or a month or a year, you'll eventually have the whole prayer more or less on a level of basic understanding and comprehension. But you need those, you need the general structure and you need also the bite-sized parts. So here, I think the author is also saying that. He's not saying that people should not be learning in depth. What he's saying is that people should not be spending so much time on depth that they never get around to the breadth. Rather, they should be learning more material, less in depth, even though part of it might be in depth. Yeah? And then go back to understanding it part by part, which would correspond to what we're talking about in prayer, getting a general, let's say, picture of the structure of the prayer, and then going and working on it part by part. V'kol zeh einam oisim ato. But nowadays, people don't do that. They don't get the general overview and then work back and then go back and working on the details. Ki kol echad rotze lilmod tosafos, v'kol chidushim v'chidushim dechidushim, kodem sheyeda atzuras haTalmud. They just want to learn the Tosfos and learn the novelties of the novelties of the novelties of the teachings of the Tosfos before they even get a picture of what the Talmud is all about. Imken ech yatzlichu. If so, how are they ever going to succeed? Here's maybe an important point to intercede here, which is that we spoke before about the yeshiva model nowadays, having half a day of depth and half a day of breadth. Yeshiva Or Sameach, for example, here, follows that model too. And I know that people are often frustrated because of what seems to be an overemphasis on detail before they really have much of a knowledge about Gemara in general. But the yeshiva's approach, as far as I understand it, as far as I'm qualified to express it, is that here you're talking about people who, by and large, are coming into learning for the first time as adults. So that they're not kind of gradually evolving in their learning as they mature and become intellectually more, let's say, sophisticated. They've already matured and have a great degree of intellectual sophistication and an exposure to secular, by and large, a pretty, extensive exposure to secular studies. So for such a person, it is important to kind of give them a glimpse of the depth and the beauty of Torah study that they can handle as adults, because otherwise, as it is, they have the language barrier. They have the infamiliarity with the topics, and they have the barrier of not really having the skills of how to learn the Talmud. So if you only go basic on the actual content, it's really like...
I think that's where it reflects with the Chabad model, where they learn Chassidus in the morning, and it's always the first thing that they do, even before davening, because the brain is so much more capable of absorbing large amounts of information and in-depth information in the morning. And throughout the day, it starts to lag and slow down and get tired.
Yeah, that's true.
So I think that's where the same idea comes in, where you've got to learn the in-depth in the morning.
In the morning, yes.
When you're able to.
Yes.
Because later on in the day, you're going to be sitting there and just puzzled.
Yeah.
At least you're processing.
Yeah, that's certainly true. Of the parts of the day, the morning is more appropriate to learn in depth than the afternoon. And if you mention Chabad or other yeshivas, the custom is to start off the day learning anyway Hasidus, where the idea is that the ideas of Judaism person should expose themselves anew each day to the ideas of Judaism in order to inspire you for the day, to want to learn, to want to pray, to be enthusiastic about it. But I'm speaking about here the modeling yeshiva, learning in the morning, iyun, might seem to be an overemphasis against what the author is saying here, and I'm just trying to explain that the reason why that would never be justified here is to give people who are intellectually mature and developed an impressive exposure to the depth of Torah, even as beginners, because otherwise, if you keep it, like I said, there are enough impediments as it is that if you keep the material basically simplistic and introductory, then people are going to say, well, there's really not much to this, and want to go elsewhere. So they think the yeshiva's approach is to try and translate and expose people, and then in English, right, try and unleash some of the beauty and the depth of the Talmud to impress people about what's really there. But ultimately, once a person's turned on, the idea would be then to cover more material and then go back and cover more depth.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Let me try and just quickly finish off this paragraph before we have to break for today. A person who's learning only in depth and not breadth is doing the opposite of what was suggested by the sages of the Talmud. Because everything that's said in the Talmud is truth. And therefore the Talmud tells you should learn more superficially first and then go back and fill in the details. That's the way it should be done. We shouldn't change that. Not to add or detract from the way that the Talmud teaches us how one should learn. Through the great expenditure of energy here in learning, and learning in depth and this Talmudic hair splitting, rabim porshin min alimud. Many people just leave learning altogether. Mirov Torah hashmos, because it's just too thick, it's too dense. Like you said, a person can have an experience where it's confusing and he doesn't want to continue. V'adiktuk shomer al pei, and all of these things. Because they say, how can I understand these ideas? It would be wonderful if I just knew what was written. And now you're coming to add in what's written. So many different types of theoretical discussions and extrapolations. Let's just learn what the text says. If these people did learn regularly, consistently, day after day, day and night, then they would be learning, and eventually over time they would have a familiarity with the entire Talmud. Then they would actually have a desire to go into the greater detail. Because their heart would already be expansive enough to understand the detail. And this, by the way, is one of the advantages of the Daf Yomi, learning a page of Talmud on a daily basis. It takes 7 years. Even when you're learning a page a day, it takes 7 years. That's a long time. But this type of iyun, you learn 7 lines a day. So you're talking about, you'll never finish. V'hayadam ba'lilmod la'olam, nim v'lo nim, tir v'lo tir, v'hayu mosifim b'kach yirat shamayim shalema. But if learning was done in this way, it would be more approachable to more people, and people would ultimately be able to learn properly, consistently, and gain Yirat Shamayim as well. V'gam hayu misrabim talmidim, the number of students who were learning would increase. V'hayu oiskim talmid b'Torah, and they would always be involved in Torah, because it's something which is accessible to them. But now, because of this type of energy that's required to expend in order to connect this type of learning, the learning becomes like too heavy of a burden, and they can't stand looking at it. And they're not drawn to it. It's not satisfying, fulfilling in them anyway. So what do? Watch a movie. Be involved in frivolous types of activities. And they get confused and they nullify, and they're engaged in all different types of activities which are unacceptable. They in the hem, Yirat Shamayim, as a result, they lack the Yirat Shamayim. So what he seems to be saying here is making an argument of the fact that an overemphasis on depth is not good for most people. They're not going to get anywhere with their learning. And most people are actually going to be turned off by that form of learning because they can't connect to it. It's too abstract. It's too theoretical. It's too slow. It doesn't cover enough basis. It doesn't reflect it. It doesn't affect them in their daily lives. They're going to therefore become distracted from it and ultimately be repulsed by it. And God forbid, go into other negative things. So it would be much better, he says, to have a superficial exposure to many different areas of learning. Ultimately, in the long run, that'll make people more acquainted in learning, desire to learn more, and have more people learning and be more knowledgeable about Torah study. It's a very interesting point. Yeah. That's really not the general yeshiva model nowadays, but it's worth considering, keeping in mind. All right, let's end here. We'll hopefully be able to finish tomorrow this section.